Welcome, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining. My name is Julie Mughal, and I am the Associate Director for the Humanitarian Action in the Center for Social Impact. On behalf of the Center and our other sponsors, the University Honors Program, the Humanitarian Action Minor, the Department of Psychology, and the Residential College Program, I am pleased to welcome you to this important and timely presentation. Before I introduce Sara Ritchie of the Keno Border Initiative, I want to go through some of our housekeeping points. Everyone will be muted, but we would be happy to take your questions through the Q&A function. Please feel free to submit questions, and Professor Madden, my co-teacher in our Refugee Literature Honors course, will collect them and moderate the Q&A after Sara's presentation. After the Q&A, I will put a link into the chat and ask you to complete a brief survey. Sara, as well as the Center for Social Impact, would greatly appreciate your feedback. And now, without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce Sara Ritchie. Sara is currently the Director of Communications for the Keno Border Initiative. She was born, raised, and attended university in Virginia, and then relocated to Guatemala, where she worked from 2016 to 2020 before joining KBI last year. In Guatemala, she worked with community development projects in both Guatemala and El Salvador that aim to increase economic opportunities for the local community in efforts to prevent forced migration. She now applies this understanding of the push-pull factors of migration to her work at the Keno Border Initiative on the US-Mexico border. It is my pleasure to hand over to Sara.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation. And I hope that this evening I can broaden your horizons a little bit about what is happening on the US-Mexico border and or solidify some of the things that you already know. So one of the things or the main topic at hand is what exactly the Biden administration is inheriting. A lot of the political rhetoric is about some of the damage that has been caused by the Trump administration, as well as COVID-19. And whereas that pertains to other political realms, it most definitely pertains to the border as well. And so to be able to understand what the damage is or what the future looks like for the Biden administration and the US-Mexico border, it does involve looking back on what exactly was happening over the past 4 years. And so that's what I'll be starting with, just to kind of bring us to present day, to be able to project a little bit more about what the possibilities are for the future and what it is that we're seeing right now. Because if you're paying attention to the news, it was just last Friday that asylum seekers that were part of MPP, which will be explained, were allowed to enter the US, and that is a process being rolled out as we speak. So it's exciting to see some of that happen along the border, but there's also a lot of other demographics that aren't seeing that kind of movement. And so that's what we'll be focusing on today as well, once we get to the end. So just to, let's see here, kind of orient us to where I am and where KBI, or the Keno Border Initiative, is. You can see the whole US-Mexico border there, and we are in the Sonoran Desert. We are in Arizona. So there are two Nogaleses. There's Nogales, Arizona, and there's Nogales, Sonora. And so we are a binational organization. You can see, if you can see my mouse, you can see that this is our building here, and the infrastructure of the port of entry is right there in the kind of top right part of the screen. And then right on the other side there is Arizona. So just to kind of give you an aerial shot of how close to the border we are. But we are a binational organization because we do have a foot on both sides of the border, in Arizona and in Sonora, both called Nogales. A lot of times people say the border crossed Nogales, actually, and it did indeed. It goes right through the town, and a town that used to interact pretty harmoniously and seamlessly now has a border wall running through it. And so we are right on that wall on both sides. And so we provide humanitarian aid to migrants who, just to clarify, are indeed on the Nogales, Sonora side. If they were on the Arizona side, we wouldn't have as much of an issue, but they are on the Sonora side. And that's where we provide services such as food service. We'll be opening our shelter soon. We provide medicine. We can help fill prescriptions. And then beyond that, we also are helping with legal services if they need to press charges because of some sort of crime they've been part of in Mexico. We have a psychologist on hand that's able to offer group therapy as well as individual therapy, because it is a very vulnerable population that comes usually with either very specific trauma or compounded trauma just from a long journey and the trauma they may have endured in their home country. And so we absolutely want to be able to address that as well. And all of the humanitarian aid that we're providing is the hands-on work that we do, but we also do more than that. So we do education, or in other words, awareness raising, and we also do advocacy. So finding other organizations that can share the stories that we are experiencing each and every day along the border, that can push for policy changes, and we ourselves also push for policy changes. And all of that is so that we can see more humane, more just, workable migration on that very border where we find ourselves. And so for us, something that we have seen over the past, 4 years was the dismantling of asylum. And so one thing that I really also want to clarify right now is that people talk about there not being asylum because of the pandemic. And I think it's really important to go ahead and discard that right off the bat, because the dismantling of asylum predates the pandemic. And so this attack that we saw on asylum, a legal form of migration, did not say illegal, a legal form of migration, was completely annihilated. And that might seem like a really strong word, and that's exactly the word I want to use for this. And as I start to explain it, maybe it will make sense more why I use that word. And so taking some other reporters' words and some other headlines, I found two that are just from the past couple of months, actually, that I think really encapsulate what it was that we were seeing and feeling day in and day out on the border. And so I'll just read these out loud because I think they deserve to be read. America's immigration system was already broken. Trump made a weapon out of its shards. He didn't invent the cruelty, he just cherished it. So not my words, but rather of another reporter's. You can look up and Google that headline, and I very much recommend the read. And this points out a couple of things. We've been hearing for really decades, the immigration system is broken. And that means a lot of different things for a lot of different people, which we won't get into all of it. But what is this idea that Trump made a weapon out of its shards? In those shards there, you can see Trump's face, and you also see Stephen Miller's face. And it was truly those two, or truly Stephen Miller, that really was able to piece together a series of attacks against the asylum population, or asylum seeking population, and to layer all of these policies to really just choke off any sort of asylum at the US-Mexico border, which we'll get into in just a moment. And this is also another idea to think of. Asylum is dead, and the myth of American decency died with it. And so again, we see this broken system here. Donald Trump took a broken system and turned it into a machine of unchecked cruelty. And that's another headline that I think is worth, looking up, reading, and also pondering this idea of American decency and what our asylum system is even rooted in. And so just reviewing that in the most concise, quickest way possible, the idea of asylum emerged after the Holocaust. So the idea that how was it that something as atrocious as the Holocaust could happen? And when countries got together at the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, they were all baffled that such a thing could have happened and came together to create some sort of standard and some sort of responsibility that countries had to not return someone to such persecution and harm. And so the way that the US adopted this was in our 1981 or 1980, and then took effect in 1981 Refugee Act. And the US said, we will not accidentally return someone to harm. And they said accidentally. We would rather err on the side of hearing someone out and making sure that they truly are saying what they mean or claiming, or they actually are speaking the truth that they are fleeing some sort of persecution, and honor that claim and hear them out instead of accidentally returning them to a place where they could face violence and possibly death. And so rooted in that is this image of asylum and what it looked like before Trump. Now, I'm specifically explaining what it looks like at the border, because it looks different when you're in another country and you're asking the US to honor your claim, and then you wait for that claim while you're in your home country. This is showing up at the border, showing up at the US's doorstep. What does that look like? So going through it quickly, migrants first either show up at a port of entry, right? Because these are all land ports of entry, or they perhaps cross in the desert and then they're apprehended by Border Patrol. And the very first thing that is supposed to happen, and that is instigated by the US, is to ask that person if they are fleeing some sort of harm. And if that person says yes, or expresses any sort of fear of persecution, then that, by law, that agent, the border agent, whether it's Border Patrol or someone in a CBP uniform at the port of entry, they have to take the asylum seeker to the USCIS office. And that's the office that conducts interviews that are called credible fear interviews. So a series of questions right then and there on the spot are asked. And if it is found that that person has some sort of credible fear, then they are granted an asylum hearing. And then they go into the US and they typically can work, be with family. They might be detained for part of it, but they're in the US and they go to their asylum hearings while being in the US. So just to kind of break that down again, show up at the port of entry or apprehended in the desert. You then go to USCIS for your credible fear interview, or the agent takes you there. That interview then happens, and if you have passed your credible fear interview, you're granted a court date, and you wait for that court date in the US. And so how asylum changed in the Trump era was first with metering lists. And so essentially a metering list is a wait list for asylum, or creating some large waiting room. And the names of asylum seekers in Nogales were kept in a handwritten notebook by Mexican officials at the port of entry. At some points, it was managed by an NGO. At some points, it was managed by a Mexican entity. Currently, the municipality has this handwritten list, but at each port of entry, all along the US-Mexico border, it looked different. And that's something that's really important to keep in mind. So nothing was systemized. And so it could be KBI manages it at Nogales, but in Tijuana, it's the Mexican officials that are handling it. But in Matamoros, it's perhaps a different NGO or a state-run organization. And so the US pretty much, when it said, we are going to create this wait list, it put it in the hands of Mexican officials or Mexico and said, we'll let you know when we're ready to take asylum seekers. We'll tell you how many we're taking that day, and you manage the list and you tell us who's coming that day. So that list became rampant with corruption. Numbers were given and then numbers were sold. People dropped out of the list, sold their number. And so we found a lot of issues with the idea of keeping a list that was not well organized, not systemized, and not run by the US. And so the US never indicated how long those waits would be. There was no way of projecting if someone was going to wait 3 weeks or 3 months. And so people were forced, or asylum seekers were forced, to just kind of hang out without knowing until the US said, okay, we're ready for more, and hoping that Mexican officials would call their number. And so the number of asylum seekers allowed to enter the US daily was subject to change, again, making it impossible to project. And there was no way for asylum seekers to, sorry, this got cut off, to hold their spot or to secure some sort of appointment, because the US wasn't sure when that would even be. And so this idea of you could come to the US's doorstep, you could come to the port of entry, you could say, I'm fleeing harm, and be granted that credible fear interview right away, then became a wait list. On top of that, we then saw the implementation of migrant protection protocols. If you're following the news right now, this is probably what you're hearing the most about. And hopefully some of it makes sense, and hopefully I can make it make more sense. MPP is what I'll keep referring to it as, but it does stand for Migrant Protection Protocols, which is a fairly deceiving name. It's also known as the Remain in Mexico policy. So it was the idea that, okay, first you're on the metering list, then your number gets called. And then once your number is called and you go through the credible fear interview, you're then returned to Mexico. The US has said, yep, we believe you, your fear is credible, we will give you a court date, and your court date is on such and such date, and please show up at X port of entry on that date. And you'll just keep doing that until your asylum claim is has been heard. And asylum hearings and processes take months and months if they're fast, or a year or more. So, for example, migrant protection protocols were implemented in Nogales in January of 2020. And we were the last port of entry to be receiving migrants or asylum seekers under the migrant protection protocols, because it was rolled out all along the southern US border at different moments. So the first port of entry to receive migrants was in January of 2019. So 2 years and 1 month ago. But in Nogales, it was 1 year, 1 month ago. And so they were being returned to Nogales and told, please go show up in Juarez, a 12-hour bus ride away on such and such date. Those asylum seekers that were returned in January of 2020 were given court dates for April of 2020. And between being returned and their court date is when the pandemic hit and completely exacerbated the entire situation. So we'll get to that in just a second. I want to come back and just look at the US-Mexico border again. I showed you where we were earlier, right? So if you can see my mouse, or you can see where Arizona and Sonora are, we're smack dab kind of in the middle. And that's where Nogales is. And where was their MPP court date? In Ciudad Juarez. So again, getting there takes about 12 to 16 hours. And you can see that there were only 4 MPP courts all along the US-Mexico border. And so really creating a system that was not efficient and making people make long journeys in not safe areas, because all along the US-Mexico border is where there's increased cartel and mafia, activity that is not just about smuggling drugs. It is about smuggling people and migrants as well. And they very much do prey on the desperation of migrants and asylum seekers. And so that was incredibly concerning to receive people in Nogales being told to make a trip to Ciudad Juarez. During the existence, let's say, of MPP, there were over 68,000 asylum seekers that were returned to Mexico as part of this program. I do have a typo here. 60,000 at the time of the pandemic, 68,000 total up until today. Just some statistics about MPP and how difficult it was to win an asylum claim as part of MPP. Only 4.1% of asylum seekers and migrants who attended their MPP hearings were granted some sort of relief. And those that had an attorney were 10 times more likely to be successful, but only 9.3% of migrants that attended their hearings were legally represented. And that was absolutely the point. The idea was, if people wait in Mexico, they'll probably do one of two things. They'll give up because they can't endure being at a border town for months and months and then over a year, or they won't be able to get a lawyer and they won't win anyways. And so that is a huge, huge problem when you tell someone to wait in a country in which they are not seeking asylum. How would one possibly get a lawyer from the US to represent them at their court hearing? So now let's look at COVID-19. I've already explained some very dark policies, right? We've covered metering, we've covered MPP. COVID-19 was absolutely the vehicle for the immigration agenda that Trump wanted. And so that's when metering lists stopped. They stopped adding names to it at some ports of entry, also confusing. The ones that are red are the ones that they closed. The ones that are green are the ones that kept adding names to the list. So that became very confusing, and we're not sure what would possibly happen with the lists in the red areas after the pandemic. I don't think the US thought of that either. I also don't think the US thought that almost a year later, we'd still be in a pandemic, but we are. And so how COVID-19 worsened the situation. So since March 21st, the US has said that the border is closed to non-essential traffic. Asylum has been deemed non-essential, so therefore there is no asylum. And the way in which that can be carried out is through Title 42. I'll explain what that is in just a second. Those MPP hearings, I mentioned earlier that someone returned in January of 2020, would then have a court date for April 2020. Well, they've never seen their court date yet. They're still in Nogales. So every single migrant ever returned to Nogales under MPP never got a court date. And they kept getting postponed, and then postponed indefinitely until the pandemic ends, which of course no one knows when that will be. There's also disappeared metering lists. That's a particular problem in Nogales right now because we can't access it. We can't see if there are names that are on there of people that we serve, that we don't serve. The municipality says that they have the list, but won't turn it over. So we're not sure what will happen with that at the end of the pandemic. There were discrepancies with MPP. During the border closure, some people were getting returned to Nogales under MPP still, even though MPP courts weren't open. And then some people that should have gotten MPP didn't. And so it's been very confusing. But the overall policy that is keeping asylum halted for the indefinite future is Title 42, which is, in my opinion, an overlooked policy and an overlooked issue. And so it was with those border closures on March 21st of 2020, and still to this day, that the US invoked Title 42. And what Title 42 is a policy that the US can invoke, saying that anyone who is not a US citizen is deemed inadmissible for the sake of public health. And so it wasn't like it was a policy or something that was created because of the pandemic. It's always been there. It was just invoked because of the pandemic. And so that's what I mean by the pandemic, or COVID-19 absolutely became the vehicle for the immigration policy or agenda that the Trump administration always wanted. We can invoke Title 14 and, well, there is no asylum then. It's on hold. And so Title 42 is what that looks like as far as policy. And so out of these issues and these policies that have choked off asylum along the US-Mexico border is something kind of unexpected to us, and it is the Save Asylum movement and this sense and spirit of activism amongst migrants. And so these are migrants that for the past 7 months, since August, they've organized 6 different marches. They march through downtown Nogales. They march right past the port of entry. They stop and pray in front of the port of entry. And then they continue to march along the border wall. So right next to all the steel beams, right at the border wall. They pick a point where they stop and they continue the programming. And the point where they stop, right on the other side, which is the Arizona side, or Nogales, Arizona, is where a group of immigration advocates and defenders meet and support them. So they don't march with them, but they march along the wall, and they stop at the same point. And that's where they lift up these testimonies of asylum seekers, and they call on other immigration advocates to support and call on, well, then the Trump administration, now the Biden administration, to save asylum. And that's the hashtag, the tagline, the title, the name that they have chosen in English, and then in Spanish, Salva el Asilo. And so this is a little bit more about what I want to focus on, at least for the next couple of minutes, and kind of showcase their activism and showcase their organizing, because it's really impressive to us. So hopefully this image at least captures some of the spirit of activism. You can see here all ages participate. They stand in front of the border wall and they take turns sharing their testimonies. And it's all planned. And so you can see that spot there, and that's the border wall right next to them. And I want to take a moment, actually, to go ahead and show you some footage. Actually, I'll hold off just a second, but I have footage from one of the marches, the most recent march, that happened on January 19th, very symbolically on Inauguration Eve, calling on the Biden administration to save asylum. He promised during his campaign that he would do so. And some of the things that he has done so far, just to kind of catch us up to speed to where we are currently on February 23rd, is on the very first day in office, he ended new enrollments in MPP, which is a great first step. So no one else could have been returned to Mexico under MPP. He's continued with rolling back MPP and signed executive orders stating that he would look into MPP and restore asylum. He's finally gotten around to make that a little bit more concrete. And starting on February 19th, 3 ports of entry, 1 in California and 2 in Texas, so they skipped Arizona, started processing asylum seekers that have active MPP cases. So just to kind of put it in perspective again, like one of those migrants that I talked about earlier that might have been returned to Nogales in January of 2020 that had a court date set for April that kept getting postponed. That's still an active MPP case because they never gave up on their case and they never had a court hearing to go to be absent for. So their case is still active. And right now there are 25,000 asylum seekers with active MPP cases that are eligible to be processed. And slowly but surely, it is happening. I just spoke today with a friend in Tijuana, and they're processing 25 people a day at the Tijuana San Ysidro port of entry. I don't know how fast they're going in Texas, but I really hope they're not going slower. And the idea is to ramp up to 300 asylum seekers a day. However, those in Nogales are still waiting. So at this point, asylum seekers in Nogales are awaiting a scheduled phone call. Those phone calls start tomorrow and go through the first couple weeks of March. It is a phone call in which they will check the person's ID, which I'm very curious to understand how that works on a phone call, and probably gather other information as well. For example, if they're still on the border, if they're still pursuing their case, pretty much checking for their eligibility to be processed at port of entry to be determined. They've made no announcements that Nogales or any port of entry in Arizona will be one of those that is going to be processing asylum seekers. So our fear is that they're going to have them go to Ciudad Juarez. So if we think back to that map that we looked at earlier, and we think about that 12 to 16 hour bus ride, we are afraid that will be the fate of asylum seekers in Nogales, which is why we're pushing for Nogales to be one of the ports of entry where they process asylum seekers, which only seems fair because it is where CBP decided to return them to. So we will see how that pans out. But so much of the media right now is focusing on MPP because that is the movement that we're seeing. And that is part of what's so concerning as well. Only those with active MPP cases are being considered right now for asylum. Title 42, so declaring everyone and anyone inadmissible, is still in effect. Biden has not addressed Title 42 or any plans to rescind it. And so that's something that I do think is really important to keep in mind. It's really important to celebrate that those 25,000 asylum seekers that are eligible will be able to enter the US. The date is to be determined, but there has been promise, and we're seeing it being rolled out as we speak, or rolled back as we speak. But there are other demographics of asylum seekers. What about those on the metering lists? What about those who came after the pandemic? And as we saw in Nogales, there was no metering list to put your name on because it closed at the start of the pandemic. That's a whole year almost of a border closure, no names added to a wait list. Not that we really wanted names to be added to a corrupt wait list, but the point is more people have come since then because the root causes are even greater right now. We've seen hurricanes strike Central America. We're seeing it totally ravage the economy of developed countries, the pandemic, I mean. And so think about what that's doing in developing countries. And so people are immigrating for those reasons as well. And so it's concerning to us how slowly this is being rolled out because people are still arriving at the border and people have been at the border. And so that's what I want to highlight with this video that I'm going to show you all, that shows kind of the spirit of the Save Asylum marches that have been organized. So the footage you're about to see, keep in mind, is the 6th action since August of 2020. And so I will go ahead and let's see, I didn't mean to stop sharing. And I will show you all the video.
Soy Elena, soy estudiante de cine. Vengo con mi hijo Emilio. He estado en la frontera desde el 16 de marzo del 2020.
Soy Nieves, soy solicitante de asilo. He estado en la frontera de Nogales desde el día 10 de diciembre del 2019.
Soy Esmeralda, estudiante de asilo. He estado en la frontera desde el día 8 de noviembre del 2019.
Un día más de espera aquí en Nogales, Zika, incertidumbre, vivir en el limbo, no saber a comer o no, pasar frío, tristeza, angustia, desesperación y temor de que puedan arrebatarte a tu hijo. Ni un día más.
Un día más de espera para mí significa, como madre soltera de 3 niñas de 9, 6 y 3 años, el miedo a salir y no regresar, dejarlas completamente solas en un lugar donde nadie las conoce.
Un día más de espera significa para mí mucho temor porque estoy acá sola, soy una mujer sola. Muy feo estar en un lugar así, solo, sin contar con nadie. Ni un día más, por favor.
So I hope that that helps a visual and helps remind us also that there is a large population of asylum seekers that are on the border. And if we think back to those dates, you know, December of 2019, November of 2019, and March of 2020, that's how long those 3 narrators of that video have been in Nogales. And there are thousands and thousands more that have had waits now for over a year. And those 3 women don't have MPP. And so, yes, they will see their friends that they've made, the acquaintances that they've made, the people that they've met at KBI slowly start to get processed, a very small sliver. And then what about them? What about people that came after MPP or that never got a chance to be part of MPP? And so that's why right now we're focusing on this idea of not one more day, but also highlighting these voices as well, because their voices that encapsulate something that the media is not paying attention to right now. And so we want to bring those testimonies, those voices, and those situations into our communications and into our advocacy, into our hearts as well. And that's really, I don't want to say easy, but it's easier for you to do if you're on the border and talking with these women every day. But when you're looking at it like a policy, you might not necessarily hear these voices or think of these voices. And so that would be my request to you all, is to think about these voices. I'll give Julie and Christopher this link, and I hope that it's something that you share with those people that you know. And I hope you use it as a tool to educate others that maybe aren't aware about people that are waiting on the border for so long, and use it as a chance to lift up, yes, what is coming out of the media and what is happening with MPP, because that's worth celebrating, because you have to find things to celebrate too. But also bringing these voices back into the conversation. And so that's why I'm really appreciative to have had this opportunity to be here to, in some small way, bring those voices back in, and to hopefully educate you all a little bit more about what it is that we're experiencing on the border. And I hope that this has kind of sparked your interest to learn more and to keep following what's happening on the border and keep pushing for people like Elena, Esmeralda, and Nieves, the narrators of the video, to also be processed, because they too have been denied their right to seek protection in the US, because after all, the US did guarantee that to asylum seekers and to those demographics and populations fleeing harm. And the US has drastically fallen short of that guarantee in the last couple of years. And so there's a lot of reparation, a lot of damage control to be done with this administration. So I know that you all have been exploring these policies already as part of your class and listening to some podcasts, and also exploring some other materials. And I appreciate that interest and that commitment to do so. I know that there are also questions that you all have come up with. And so, Chris, if you feel like this is a good time to transition to questions, I'm excited and happy to answer them.
Absolutely. So, Sara, thank you, first of all, for the presentation and illuminating some of these issues, and just seeing the numbers and seeing the area really puts a face to it. So we have some questions from our students. Again, I'm Christopher Madden, for those of you who are not in my classes. Professor Mughal and I teach a honors course at Fairfield University about finding answers, which attempts to solve impossible problems. And the focus of this course is looking at the worldwide refugee crisis. So I have a few questions from students. Participants can also put some questions in the chat, and if we have time, we will work a few of those in. So please go ahead and use the chat function if you'd like to ask a question. And I'll start with one about the political environment. So do you think the Biden administration will be able to change the immigration laws to the point of making an actual difference with a split Congress and the influx of conservative judges appointed by the Trump administration?
Oh, such a loaded question. To answer the first part of it, if he or his administration can, I think something to highlight is specifically for us along the US-Mexico border, there's so much political will into designing structures and using taxpayer dollars, etc., into creating these systems that either deter migrants and or make it that we try to keep them on the other side. And so if the political will can be there to build this ginormous wall and to surveil it and to funnel money into Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection, then I think the same amount of political will can be poured into the other side, or the more humane side of, instead of putting so much money into a wall, putting it into processing asylum applications. And so I do think that is possible. I absolutely think the Biden administration has been dealt a really difficult hand, and we've already seen it kind of play out a little bit already as he's tried to put a freeze on deportations, and judges do try to block that. But if you look at the statistics as to what the American people want, more than half support immigration reform and more pathways to citizenship and more legal migration and more asylum. And so if truly the Biden administration can rally support around the idea that representatives and senators or representatives are meant to represent their constituents, and if that's what constituents are asking for, then I would think with a little bit more political will directed in the right direction, or what I claim to be the right direction, then yes, I think that can happen. And we're seeing it happen as we speak. It's just happening very slowly because there is a lot of damage to repair. But I do think the political will on the Biden administration's part is present. And slowly, I do think they will be able to make such changes.
Thank you. Oh, by the way, I said you could put questions in the chat. The chat's turned off, but there is a Q&A tab. So if you'd like to load your questions there, we may be able to get some of them in. So we were listening to podcasts with our students, NPR's This American Life. They won a Pulitzer Prize for the podcast about immigration. And this was a student question that came from that. The Migrant Protection Protocol, MPP, aka the Remain in Mexico policy, sounds great, but in light of the positive sounding names, how does the language downplay the human cost of the policy and the impact it's had on migrants?
I think that's such a great question. More than anything, it like that just really feels like an observation, and a very, very good observation, that the idea that this title would have the word protection in it is just so contradictory to what it actually does. The US, when convenient, claims that Mexico and the border zone is such a dangerous area, but yet has no problem returning people to that very place where they have already experienced persecution or perhaps will in the future. And so a lot of really great work and reporting has come as a result of this very deceiving name by organizations that have been measuring what people in MPP truly endure. And I can anecdotally talk about what people endure in Nogales, but reports have shown, and I would suggest that people look into Human Rights First. They've been measuring what violence, persecution, and horrible acts, also such as rape and murder, have happened specifically to people that have been returned under MPP. And there are over 1,000 instances of violence, rape, murder. And that seems unacceptable. It also plays on that idea of that headline I shared earlier, the idea of the American moral decency kind of going out the window, because the rhetoric before was not returning someone to harm. And now the US is doing so and putting the word on it, protection. So I think that's absolutely something that if you were to educate someone else about what are migrant protection protocols, point out that observation of, it sounds like a good program, but here's what it actually is, and use that kind of as the starter or the way to deliver such a comment and facts about what it really is.
Yeah, and that was one of the issues addressed in the podcast where they were talking about where they were taking migrant shoelaces away and returning them with their things in plastic bags. And so they became targets for the cartels for kidnapping because you could just look for the people without shoelaces.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Yeah.
In case somebody walked 1,400 miles to the US and was planning on hanging themselves, waiting for their asylum to be processed. Here's a quick one from the crowd. Can you please explain a little bit about why all the ports of entry aren't being open to processing MPP cases now, if you know?
That's a really good question. If we think about where the MPP courts were placed, none were placed in Arizona, and 3 were in Texas, and 1 was in California. So the Biden administration, I suppose, is just following suit with that idea of, okay, that's where MPP courts were, so that's where we'll put the ports of entry to process people. And perhaps, so it's either being overlooked that people were returned to Nogales and told to go to Juarez, or the Biden administration doesn't consider Arizona important enough because it's not one of the bigger ports of entry. So Tijuana is the largest land port of entry in terms of volume of how many crossings they typically have anyhow. And then the second largest and third largest and so on are in Texas. And so Arizona tends to be that overlooked state and sector of the border. And my thoughts would be because it's kind of just always been like that. And Arizona, really the only time Arizona is used is when the US wants to use its desert as a deterrent strategy. So there's never been a lot of port of entry infrastructure or investment into infrastructure and ports of entry in Arizona because they want people to be funneled through Texas and California so that Arizona is maintained as this vast piece of land that that would deter someone from attempting to cross it. So I think it's layered, and perhaps I'm muddying the waters more than I'm clearing them up, but hopefully that at least just points out a couple of aspects. But I think just simply because it's one, Arizona has smaller ports of entry, if I had to answer it in a quick sentence.
Okay.
Took me a while to get there.
Thank you. Right. Well, it accentuates the fact that this is not a simple issue.
Correct.
So there were a few variations of student questions about, for students that are interested, how could they get involved in what might they do or attempt to do something beneficial?
Sure. I'll give a couple of ideas that are at least happening right now. So first I'll speak generally. Generally, as I was explaining to Julie earlier, schools and churches serve as amazing structures that already kind of are a glue to bringing people together, perhaps people that are like-minded as well. And so my overall and general suggestion would be you're in these spaces, especially you all these academic spaces where hopefully it's welcomed to be considering issues and ideas and just simply informing yourselves about them and bonding and connecting with people that also care about those same issues. So my first suggestion is use the structure that's around you and the acquaintances that you have around you, because it's not so easily set up for you in other realms of life sometimes. And simply start with informing yourself. So there's great ways to check out webinars that talk about this kind of thing, and perhaps being with a group that searches for news articles, especially right now, because there's so many articles about the border. And then with that kind of group together, I would say explore advocacy efforts, because if you do it on your own, I think it becomes really overwhelming. But if you do it with a group of people and you all rally your support behind one thing, you can have a lot more impact. That is also what we as KBI look for from structures within, universities, within schools, within churches that already have expressed some sort of interest and want to continue building on that. And then we accompany and walk with them in doing so and in joining our advocacy efforts. And so one of the ways that you could get on board is follow KBI on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter. We're putting out their calls to action. We're also putting out their testimonies. We're putting out videos like the one I showed you all, which I haven't even published yet. So you guys are literally the first ones to see that. But it will go out this week, and simply just using your power on social media to share as well. And then when those calls to action do pop up, share those too and implement them into, groups that you're already part of. And so that would be my general suggestion, at least to start off with. Follow us so that you know when opportunities are available and you can continue to hear these voices from the border.
Thank you. So we're going to wrap up with one more question. This has been wonderful. Julie, I think, did you put the survey in the Q&A? You did. Okay, so there is a survey. Those of you who are with us, if you could please fill it out, we would love to hear your feedback. It's short, it's simple. You don't have to give any DNA or anything like that to take it. So please, if you just take a couple minutes, that would be fantastic. The final question, again from a student question, the humanitarian field requires tough-mindedness in order to be empathetic and feel for other people's struggles, while also remaining emotionally detached to a certain degree. How do you avoid burnout?
That's a great question, and I appreciate it. And it's something that I've thought about a lot, what my own strategies for avoiding burnout are. And the way that I think for us as a staff, I hope that I can speak on behalf of the staff, is that something that at least motivates us and keeps us going is kind of the example of what you saw in the video, the resiliency of migrants and the way that they find joy even in a very bleak situation. And so for us, it's really just simple tactics of being able to do that, and also creating some sort of boundary for where this isn't our entire life. We do have work, and we also have things outside of work as well. And like being able to turn that off and find ways of self-care. But when we're at work, finding and lifting up the joy as well, because if migrants in the bleakest of situations are able to do that and remain resilient, it's such an inspiration to be in that atmosphere. Even though I've spent a lot of this presentation telling you about the bleak parts of it, I didn't fully lift up the small talk and the conversations and the triumphs and the birthdays and the life that does go on for these migrants. And they find ways to celebrate too. And we try to find ways to celebrate with them and then do that in our own lives as well. And so I appreciate the question just because it kind of brings into the conversation, people like us that are part of the staff and have to find ways to also recognize that we're human and we don't have to tackle every single issue like tomorrow. And so that would be something that I would want you all to keep in mind too when thinking of advocacy. You don't have to tackle every single issue tomorrow either, but start with a couple and start with a couple of friends and start informing yourselves and then just see where it goes.
Thank you very much. So for the Keynote Border Initiative and Sara Ritchie, this was wonderful. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Fairfield University and all the other groups that helped co-sponsor this event. And thank you to all of you for tuning in.
And thank you for the invitation. I hope this isn't the last one.